From the 17th to the 25th of September 1944, the Western Allies would embark on the largest airborne operation in human history. Following the successful landings in northern and southern France, the Allies made headway quickly through the country, pushing the Germans out as they sought to liberate Western Europe from fascist tyranny. After successful airborne operations during the invasion of France, the Allied command decided that they strike through the Netherlands as part of a pincer move to encircle the industrial heartland of the Ruhr in West Germany would bring the war to a swift end. Although things started off well, they soon deteriorated, and the airborne forces found themselves surrounded in many cases, with the Allies failing to take their strategic objectives and the offensive ending in a failure. This video will examine the lead up to Market Garden, the course of the battle, why it ultimately failed, and the consequences this had not just for the Allied war effort, but also the Dutch people, whose liberation would be delayed as a result. It was a 3-month interval between Operation Neptune, the invasion of France, and Market Garden. The principal change in paratrooper organization between the two operations was the creation of the 1st Allied Airborne Army in August 1944 by the order of General Eisenhower. There was tension over who would lead the army, with the Americans thinking it should be one of them due to the fact that they were contributing most of the troops, and the British believing it should be Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. Although Browning was his superior, Eisenhower settled with General Lewis H. Brereton. The consensus was that of the 3 airborne divisions involved in the Normandy landings, none were ready to be thrown into battle again in the next 75 days, as they needed to be resupplied and trained. Only the British 1st Airborne Division and the Polish Airborne Brigade were available for operations until the end of July, but the Poles were not yet fully trained. A plan titled Operation Transfigure was originally envisioned to occur in August, intending to trap the German 7th Army south of Paris, but Patton's tanks were too quick, and the plan was scrapped just as quickly as it was devised. 3 more operations, Boxer, Linnet, and Linnet 2 were planned, but they too were cancelled. Airborne forces had been used by all major armies during the war, with the Germans achieving great successes in 1940 and 41. This persuaded the Western Allies to pursue the creation of their own elite paratrooper units. British and American airborne forces fought valiantly in Normandy, but they had their challenges and their critics. Critics pointed out the fact that airborne units could not carry with them heavy weaponry or large amounts of supplies, meaning they were hopelessly outmatched if they encountered heavy opposition. Those same critics also argued that airborne troopers would be better used as elite infantry, similar to the German Fallschirmjäger, who were no longer used as paratroopers after heavy losses in Crete during 1941. But the Allied Airborne Army had already been created, and both Brereton and Browning were itching for their men to be used in battle. Planning for Operation Market Garden began on September 10th, and was an expansion of the previously planned Operation Comet that had started its planning on the 4th. It would involve the British 1st Airborne, American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and the Polish Airborne Brigade, laying a carpet along the road to Arnhem, part of Operation Market, and the use of ground forces along the Meuse-Escaut Canal to the Haslet-Arnhem Highway, which was part of Operation Garden. The plan was for the Polish and the British to assault Arnhem, the 82nd to take the Nijmegen Grave area, and the 101st to seize the crossings over the waterways south of Grave. The operation was also to be executed at daytime, which, while bold, was not unprecedented, as paratroopers were used in daylight missions during the invasion of southern France. In that case, the major concern then was enemy flak, but Brereton judged that the mission would still be possible. Daytime landings also allowed shorter spacing between parachute and glider aircraft, with 4-minute intervals for parachute and 6 minutes for gliders, while Normandy had 6 and 10-minute intervals respectively. The purpose of Montgomery's ambitious plan, if executed correctly, would be to attack north, hook around the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and trap the German 15th Army. The Garden part of the operation, comprising the Guards Armoured Division, 43rd Wessex Division, and 50th Northumbrian Division, the latter two in reserve, would link up with the 101st Airborne on the first day, the 82nd by the second day, and the 1st British by the fourth. If D-Day and the ensuing weeks after had been a remarkable success for the Allies, they were also a tremendous disaster for the Germans in the West. Between the 6th of June and the 31st of August, the West Tier had lost 23,019 dead, 67,240 wounded, and 198,616 either captured or missing. Although officially fielding 24 infantry and 11 panzer divisions, these were skeletal formations, with Walter Model, now commanding Army Group B, believing that of the 11 divisions at his disposal, only 4 fully manned infantry divisions could be formed. The once mighty panzer divisions were now reduced to regimental-sized armoured units of roughly 5 to 10 tanks each. As the Germans retreated east to the fatherland, with the Allies hot on their heels, they were menaced by Allied aircraft who maintained complete air superiority, and partisan action by the French resistance who continued to chip away at their strength. On September 5th, General Oberst Kurt Student, commander of the Fallschirmjäger, received a call from Alfred Jodl, commanding him to construct a front on the Albert Canal with all available units, and that, in his words, this new front is to be held at all costs. Slowly but surely, the chaos that plagued the West here began to subside, and order began to build. Although the Germans didn't know it, the Allies had overextended their supply lines, forcing them to halt and resupply, giving the Germans crucial breathing room to build what Robert Kershaw refers to as a crust. 20,000 German paratroopers and 25 self-propelled guns and tank destroyers of the 1st Parachute Army, a disappointing number according to Model, began to assemble at the front line by the 7th of September, collecting weapons from train stations as they made their way to the front. British probes against the Albert Canal met stiffening resistance, and as they advanced, a clear defensive line began to form along the final water barrier to Holland. The formation of the defensive crust was not cheap for the Germans, exacting a heavy toll on the defenders who were often haphazardly thrown into the line to buy any amount of time. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Fuhlreuter writes in his diary his growing disdain towards the Army High Command, quote, 10th September, the 2nd Abteilung, following a successful attack after being inserted in the wrong place and stabbed in the back by its neighbors, was surrounded by strong forces in Hechtel and following a 3-day battle practically wiped out. Only a few stragglers and tanks returned. Almost all the tanks, armored artillery, anti-tank, and flak elements were lost, all due to the mistakes of our joke of a high command. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, containing the 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions, arrived on the 5th, but Model ordered them further east to remain in safe areas, preserved so that they could be later thrown in as part of a counterattack. The Germans continued to group the scraps of various mangled units together to form something that could resemble a cohesive military unit, and in early September, clashes between Allied and Axis ground forces continued to occur on the approaches to the bridgeheads. Model's intelligence office monitored Allied movements closely and anticipated an imminent British offensive launched towards Nijmegen, Arnhem, and Wesel. They also predicted the use of airborne troops, but were uncertain as to where exactly the Allies' first blow was to occur. Their initial prediction that an advance from the Neerpelt bridgehead was to act as a covering force via Eindhoven was incorrect, when in reality this was the Allies' main attack. And the airborne were not going to drop directly into the Ruhr, but rather parachute into the rear areas of Army Group B. Thus, the main attack would fall on 2 Kampfgruppes, led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Walter Harzer and Generalleutnant Kurt Schill, and General Wolfgang Erdmann's 7th Fallschirmjäger Division. D-Day for Operation Market Garden was set to the 17th. On the 16th, the group staffs briefed their combat crews in what are considered very organized and comprehensive briefings. However, they lacked enough detailed maps and accurate low-level photography of the landing zones and run-in areas. Just before the troopers boarded their planes on the morning of the 17th, they sat through another briefing concerning the weather. While Brereton was the final judge on whether Market Garden would occur, ultimately the Allied weathermen would dictate on whether or not Brereton's plans would occur. Fortunately for Brereton, the weather officer's forecast was good, and the attack was scheduled to begin at 1300 hours. On the night of D-1, bombers of the 282nd Squadron RAF dropped 1,180 tons of explosives targeting airfields and flak installations along the path of the airborne troop carriers. On the morning of the 17th, 872 B-17 bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force attacked 117 installations between 0930 and 1130 hours. 2 more air operations were launched by Lancasters, Mosquitoes, Spitfires, Mitchells, and Bostons against German barracks and coastal defenses. The operation would ultimately involve 5,330 aircraft and 2,596 gliders, carrying 20,793 paratroopers, 16,127 glider troops, 299 artillery pieces, 2,382 vehicles and trailers, and 2,856 tons of cargo. Despite stiffening resistance on the ground, the Allies still had faith that one big push could bring the war to a swift end, and at 10:25 a.m. on the 17th, the first Allied planes took off from their airfields to begin Operation Market Garden. Crews and troops received their final briefings at 8:30 a.m. on the 17th, and at 10:25, the first Pathfinder planes took off from Chalgrove in England. The Pathfinders of the 82nd Airborne had an easy path until Grave, where German anti-air opened fire, but were quickly silenced by fighters of the 78th Fighter Group. 101st Airborne Pathfinders found it more difficult, encountering heavy flak, with one of the planes being shot down over Ratzi. Fortunately, the other aircraft in the pair successfully dropped its troops on DZ-A and marked the landing. Planes slated for DZs B and C dropped their troops without a hitch, so closely together in fact that no assembly was necessary. British Pathfinders located their zones quickly and dropped their troops accurately at around 12:40 p.m., even capturing 15 German prisoners. The main force began to drop between 1 and 1:40 p.m. along a 60-mile carpet from Eindhoven to Arnhem. The flak-busting fighters had done a good job at silencing German AA, however this was disproportionate towards anti-air in the open, being less effective at destroying guns in wooden areas. The landings were overwhelmingly successful, with the 82nd landing 89% of its force and 84% of its gliders within 1 kilometer of their drop zones. This was in stark contrast to the nighttime landings at Normandy, in which some units were scattered up to 19 kilometers from one another. Some British paras landed within 2 miles of Model's headquarters, and Model flattered himself by believing this was an attempt at capture. General Walter Bittrich, commanding 2nd SS Panzer Corps, ordered the 9th SS to deal with the paras at Arnhem and the 10th SS to defend the bridge at Nijmegen, and the Germans reached the bridge before the Americans did, fortifying its defences. The 101st reached the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal 4 miles north of Eindhoven, but it exploded, so paratroopers had to swim across to establish a bridgehead on the south side of the canal. By midnight, the 101st held a 15-mile corridor and encountered fierce fighting. The 82nd landed successfully, seizing bridges and crossings. Advancing through towns towards Nijmegen, however, they met heavy German resistance from recon elements of the 9th SS. They failed to seize control over the Nijmegen Bridge due to both their landing zones being too far away and the surprising choice by the Allies, as Max Hastings points out, not to have fighter bombers patrolling German armor routes to cut them off from reaching the paratroopers. Troopers of the 82nd dug in 400 yards from the bridge in the wake of heavy attacks, but ultimately failed to take the bridge. The British paras landed successfully near Arnhem and Oosterbeek, but were plagued by a lack of effective communications to coordinate their maneuvers. Most of the glider troops stayed put to guard their landing areas for the following day, and the paratroopers had been stopped short of the Arnhem Bridge. Further complicating the Allied effort was the fact that the Nazis secured a set of Market Garden's air plans from a downed glider, giving Model intimate knowledge of the Allied objectives and order of battle. More drops occurred on the 18th, and the British paras made headway towards Arnhem Bridge but were halted by frequent skirmishes. British columns became overextended, and the Germans quickly mopped up the stragglers. The 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions reached within 2 kilometers of the bridge with 200 men, 1/6 their original strength. The 82nd was still under attack on the Groesbeek Heights east of Nijmegen. The 508th Regiment secured a landing zone the Germans had taken, and glider troops, field artillery, and medical support elements began to land from 3:30 p.m. The 101st tried and failed to secure a bridge at best after losing the one at Son. Linking up with the Irish Guards and recon units from the 30th Corps, they formed bridgeheads along the Merseyschode Canal in the face of determined German resistance. The British 1st Parachute Brigade renewed their attack at 3 a.m. on the 19th. The 1st Battalion, supported by the 3rd Battalion, 2nd South Staffordshires, and 11th Battalion, was halted by the Germans. Under heavy fire from 3 sides, the 1st Battalion disintegrated, the 3rd Battalion fell back, and all but 150 Staffordshires were overwhelmed by noon. The 2nd Battalion, still in control of the northern approach to the bridge, had been relentlessly bombarded by the Germans, and in spite of the overwhelming odds, held on to their ground valiantly. The 504th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne made contact with the Grenadier Guards of 30th Corps at 8:20 a.m., advancing within 400 meters of Nijmegen Bridge before being halted. They also secured the traffic bridge south of Weeken. The 101st were halted by German counterattacks in the morning, but support from British armour pushed the Germans back by the afternoon. Counterattacks by Panthers and anti-tank guns beat back Allied armour. 78 German bombers attacked Eindhoven unchallenged, with the Allies having no AA to retaliate, turning the city centre into rubble and lighting Eindhoven on fire. Despite their requests for air support and resupply, poor weather prevented the Allies from flying most of their support missions. The luck of the various parachute divisions on the 20th varied greatly. The 101st had an easy time, save a repulse by the 107th Panzer Brigade, but that was driven back. The 501st occupied Dinter and pushed to Heeswijk, killing 40 Germans and capturing 418. This success made them prematurely conclude that the Germans in their vicinity were finished. The 82nd tried once again to take the Nijmegen Bridge, but were counterattacked by the German 6th Parachute Division. The Germans tried pinching off the 82nd at Groesbeek Ridge, but failed, with ferocious fighting lasting until the night. That morning, however, the 504th were relieved by British troops and, combined with the 505th, attacked the Nijmegen Bridge and had seized it by 6:30 p.m. For the British, the 20th had been a failure across the board. The Germans had gained access to the bridge and cut off 2 battalions of the 4th Parachute Brigade near Wolfhazen. The Germans relentlessly shelled the beleaguered paras at a rate of 50 mortar shells a minute. Though the British held on doggedly, their line refusing to break, the Germans bit by bit bent it inwards. The Poles, who had no involvement in Market Garden thus far, once again had their mission postponed due to fog for another 24 hours. Another glider mission intended to aid the 82nd was cancelled too. Allied commanders still believed that success was within reach, under the impression that Arnhem Bridge was secured by the British. Tanks were rushed forward from Nijmegen to relieve the British at Arnhem on the 21st, but the delay doomed it to failure. The Paris continued to stubbornly defend its perimeter in spite of German armour, infantry charges, and scarcity of food, water, and ammunition. The 82nd, exhausted by 4 days of constant fighting, waited for relief by the 43rd British Division, but the British were too slow, their truck drivers refusing to pull off the roads for fear of mines and causing terrible traffic jams. An Allied air mission containing Polish paratroopers, gliders for the 82nd, and towing gliders and supplies for the 101st was attempted. While it was mostly successful, the weather prevented much of the fighter escort from leaving England, giving the Luftwaffe a great opportunity to attack an Allied airborne mission. 1,511 Polish troopers took part in the mission, of which 998 dropped in the vicinity of their landing zones, and 750 of them were able to assemble that evening. The Poles reached the riverbank of the Rhine at 9 p.m., but saw the opposite shore in German hands. An attack was attempted at Hervéadorp, but failed. All airborne missions on the 22nd were cancelled due to bad weather. A German offensive at 11 a.m. by the 107th Panzer Brigade and 280th Assault Gun Brigade cut the Allied corridor near Fagel, which was defended by only the 2nd Battalion of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. While unable to actually take the town, owing to the presence of British armour and artillery en route to Nijmegen, they managed to cut the highway both north and south of the town. While the 101st had a tough day, the 82nd comparatively had a relaxed one. They pushed to Pals, 3 miles east of Nijmegen, and some patrols of the 508th Regiment met stiff resistance. The day was also marked by a significant British attempt to cross the Rhine by the British 43rd Division. At 8:30 a.m., they attacked a very weak German position at Oosterhout, but the British acted like they had an army defending it, and proceeded with too much caution. By 6 p.m., they reached Polish positions at Driel and only managed to cross 50 Polish troopers across the Rhine on improvised rafts. The German offensive at Fagel had run out of steam by the 23rd. The large thrusts had devolved into small stabs that were easily parried by the 101st, who pushed north to link up with the 32nd Guards at 6 p.m. D+6 saw weather clear up at last, allowing previously cancelled airborne missions to go ahead on the route via Berg Leopold and Eindhoven. The aircraft turned north at Giel instead of Berg Leopold, flying outside the Allied salient and coming under heavy fire, many of the gliders dropping prematurely due to flak and other reasons. Soldiers who attempted to use visual signals to mark landing zones were harassed by mortar and sniper fire, and the Germans even used fake signals to confuse the pilots. The British perimeter further north was only 1,000 yards in diameter and surrounded by the enemy. The Germans tried the whole day to cut off the British from their northern bridgehead, but they held on, and the Poles to the south were also attacked but were relieved by the arrival of several tanks from 30th Corps. The 20th was a turning point for the offensive, as the Allies now abandoned the original objective of crossing the Rhine, settling instead to form a defensive front line in Nijmegen. The Nazis attacked Eerd, attempting to cut the highway, which was fought off by all 3 battalions of the 501st. An attempt was made to reinforce the British paras with the 43rd Division, which included the 4th Dorsetshire Regiment and the Polish Brigade. It failed, and the Dorsets were ravaged as they crossed the river right into German positions. This finally persuaded the Allies to withdraw the British paras from the northern bridgehead on the Rhine. Resupply for the 101st was attempted, flying 49 tons of howitzer ammo, medical supplies, and food. Supplies were also dropped further north to help the British paras, but they failed to recover a single bundle. Montgomery gave the order for the 1st Airborne to be withdrawn south of the river, which began at 2200 hours. British and Canadian engineers ferried troops across the Rhine, covered by the 3rd Polish Battalion. Ironically, the poor weather that had plagued much of the operation and doomed the British ended up saving them. The howling wind and rain gave the paras the opportunity to stealthily escape with the Germans completely unaware. 300 troopers, including the wounded, were left on the bridgehead to man its defences, and were captured the following day at first light. Thus, by the end of the 25th of September 1944, the greatest airborne operation in history ended in failure. The end of Operation Market Garden saw the Allies controlling a corridor into the Netherlands 50 miles long, ultimately leading nowhere. While Montgomery said the operation was 90% successful, this was merely consoling words in the face of utter defeat. Fighting still occurred from the 26th onwards, with the Germans trying to control or destroy the Nijmegen Bridge by land and air. Luftwaffe pilots flew numerous sorties trying to destroy the bridge, but suffered heavily, losing 46 fighters in a single day. German Marine Einsatzkommandos swam 10 kilometers downstream to set charges and blow the bridge, but was only partially successful, with 10 of the 12 men killed or captured. While the rail bridge was destroyed and made totally unusable, the road bridge was only slightly damaged, and Royal Engineers simply spanned a Bailey Bridge across both the road and railway bridges, making them usable once again. The British and Polish paratroopers suffered 1,130 dead and 6,200 taken prisoner, the 101st Airborne 315 dead, 547 missing and 1,248 wounded, and the 82nd 215 dead, 427 missing and 790 wounded. The British 1st Airborne would never recover from the terrible losses during Market Garden, with the 4th Parachute Brigade disbanded. Allied failure during Operation Market Garden can be explained by several key factors. Firstly, the Allies had placed the element of surprise as a key prerequisite to success during Market Garden. The bridges along 30th Corps' route, according to Brereton, needed to be captured with thunderclap surprise. If that was the case, why were troopers from the 82nd Airborne landed on Groesbeek Heights, several clicks from Nijmegen Bridge, instead of dropping them on the bridge itself? One argument could be that the paratroopers would have suffered heavy casualties dropping straight on their objectives. That may have been true, but those casualties, as Max Hastings argues, would have been trifling relative to the casualties they actually sustained fighting their way to Nijmegen and Arnhem. When this was done, at Fagel and Grave, the bridges were captured with very few shots fired. Furthermore, from the outset, Market Garden was planned to have drops occur over 3 days, which not only put the operation at the mercy of the weather, which I will elaborate on later, but also forced airborne troops to waste time and resources guarding their landing zones rather than going on the offensive. Lethargy amongst the troops of the British 43rd Division, 8th, 12th and 30th Corps to advance in support of Armour, infantry or beleaguered airborne forces at Arnhem also contributed to the operation's overall failure. This created bitterness among the various British units, and some of that continued even after the battle. When Corporal Dennis Thomas, a British tank crewman, arrived at Stalag 11B in October 1944, a British paratrooper shouted at him, "Here's another bloody tankman who's come to relieve us." There were also no plans for Allied air to intercept German troop, supply, and armour movements. This cautious approach and lack of initiative, both during the planning and execution of Market Garden, prevented what could have been a successful operation, and likely ended up with even more bloodshed. Broadly speaking, communications in the airborne units were satisfactory with the exception of the British 1st Airborne Division. British radio men and their commanders knew of the risks that radio equipment would face in such an engagement, and accepted that they would be operating at their limit. There was a lack of ground-air radio contact with incoming troop carrier missions, which prevented ground troops from steering missions away from dangerous landing zones. Long-range radios would be able to reach England but not airborne corps, and short-range radios weren't powerful enough to penetrate wooded areas near the Hardestein perimeter. While poor communications were not responsible for the 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalion's failure to reach Arnhem Bridge, it certainly contributed to large numbers of casualties amongst British land and parachute troops in their assault. Another major factor contributing to Allied failure was German preparations and organisation prior to the operation. Model exhibited remarkable organisational skill, forming new units from the shattered remnants of old ones, and bringing riffraff from units all over the German army to reinforce existing ones. He also moved 2 panzer divisions into Arnhem, and combined with poor British intelligence, gave the British an optimistic view of their chances. German organisation, combined with initiative from officers on the ground, turned depleted units into formidable fighting groups capable of defeating elite paratroopers in battle. As the Allied presence dwindled owing to casualties, fresh German units were being poured into Oosterbeek. Ultimately, the German preparation and tactics used to contain Allied breakouts was another factor that dictated the failure of Operation Market Garden. Weather was also a persistent thorn in the Allied side. It prevented the 101st from having its artillery for 2 days, the 82nd for a day, and without its glider infantry for 4 days. The Polish drop was also rescheduled repeatedly owing to poor weather, preventing them from providing much-needed aid to the British paras at the right time. The constant delays caused by weather meant that troops weren't deployed exactly when they were needed, and with an operation like Market Garden, where timing and swiftness is of the essence, helped contribute significantly to its failure. Another major consequence of Market Garden's failure was the delay of Dutch liberation and the effects this had on the Dutch people. In September, the Dutch government in exile called on railway workers to go on strike in an effort to aid Allied liberation and Operation Market Garden. In retaliation, the Germans forbade food transports to the western parts of the country. This, combined with the upcoming winter, led to mass starvation. Estimates for death tolls during the famine range from 18,000 to 22,000 by Dutch historian Lower de Jong. Furthermore, following the failure of the operation, the Germans began shooting Dutchmen they suspected of aiding the Allies out of hand, and the Netherlands would still have to wait many more months until their eventual liberation in May 1945. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation of the war and intended on going around the Siegfried Line to the north and cross the Rhine River to lay the foundation for a large-scale Allied thrust to Berlin. Airborne forces from Poland, Britain, and the United States were dropped across a 60-mile carpet, attempting to seize key bridges to allow ground forces to move through. However, issues with planning, communication, and weather ultimately doomed the operation, seeing the British paratroopers be besieged as they attempted to secure the bridge at Arnhem, ultimately failing with heavy casualties. The territory the Allies had secured was rendered useless without the Arnhem Bridge, and the resources and time dedicated to Market Garden forced other offences to be postponed, and made the Allies look elsewhere along the front for points of breakthrough. While Market Garden failed to achieve its objectives, what must be remembered was the tenacity and bravery of Allied troops, particularly the British paratroopers, who fought against overwhelming odds and mounting casualties until their evacuation. Ultimately, the Allied failure in Holland had closed the window of opportunity on the Western Front to bring about a potential victory in 1944, had they instead chosen to open up Antwerp or breaking von Rundstedt's line, and delayed Dutch liberation until much later. Thanks for watching.